Welcome back to another episode of Thump, your number one source for interesting content to feed your brain. During the Middle Ages, torture was considered a legitimate way to extract confessions, punish offenders, and perform executions. Some methods were considerably crueler than others. Different types of torture were used depending on the victim's crime, gender, and social status. In this episode, we are going to be taking a look into the top 10 medieval torture methods. But before we start, be warned, some of these methods and contraptions are rather graphic and disturbing. If you're squeamish, then this one might not be for you. Let's go. Number 10. Knee splitter. Popular during the Inquisition, this device consisted of two spiked wood blocks which were placed in front and behind the knee. The blocks, which were connected by two large screws, would be turned and made to close towards each other, destroying the knee underneath. This technique would render the knees useless. The number of spikes on the blocks varied from 3 to 20, often depending on the nature of the crime and the status of the prisoner. There were many variants to this instrument. Some claws were heated beforehand to maximize pain. Others had dozens of small claws that penetrated the flesh slowly and painfully. Number 9. Breast ripper. This one is particularly nasty. Not that the other items on this list aren't. Also known as the iron spider, it was mainly used on women who were accused of adultery, self-abortion, hearsay, blasphemy, or accused of being witches. It was also used for interrogations. The device, which was often heated during torture, contained 4 claws, which were used to slowly and painfully rip off the breasts. The instrument would be latched onto a single breast of the woman. Blood sometimes spattered onto her children. If the woman did not die, she would be disfigured for the rest of her life. Number 8. Coffin torture. This was one of the most dreaded forms of torture during the medieval period. The accused were placed inside a cage coffin, rendering them completely immobile. Overweight victims were often forced into the smaller coffin for increased discomfort. The cage was then hung from a tree, gallows, or the city walls. The period of time was determined by the crime, with some infractions like blasphemy punishable by death. Victims were often put on public display, where they would be mocked and abused by angry locals. Number 7. Head crusher. Yep, this one is exactly how it sounds. The device, which is basically a vice for the head, slowly crushes the skull and facial bones. Even if the torturer stopped before death, permanent damage to the facial muscles and structure would occur. To aggravate the pain, the torture master would sometimes amuse himself by tapping on the metal cap with a small hammer. Some variations had a receptacle in the front to catch the eyes of the victim. Number 6. Rat torture. Rats have also been employed to perform torture. There were many variants, but a common technique was to force a starving rat through the victim's body, usually the intestines, as a way to escape. To make it work, prisoners were completely restrained and tied to the ground or any horizontal surface. A rat was then placed on the stomach covered by a metallic container, which was then gradually heated. The rat began to look for a way out, which inevitably meant through the victim's body. Digging through the body usually took a few hours, resulting in a painful and gruesome death. Number 5. The breaking wheel. Also known as the Catherine wheel, this torture device was used to torture and kill prisoners for public executions. The device was a typically large wagon wheel with radial spokes. Offenders were lashed to the wheel and their limbs beaten with a club or iron cudgel. The gaps in the wheel allowed the limbs to give way and break. Disturbingly, the survival time after being broken could be extensive, with some accounts of victims living for several days before succumbing to their mortal injuries. Number 4. Saw torture. This was a form of execution in which a living person was sawed in half, either longitudinally or transversely through the central body mass. Simple, yet obviously effective and very painful. In only one case, the story about Simon the Zealot, the person is explicitly described as being hung upside down and sawn apart vertically through the middle, starting at the groin, with no mention of fastenings or support boards around the person. In other cases, where details about the method beyond the mere sawing act are explicitly supplied, the condemned person was apparently fastened to either one or two boards before sawing. Number 3. The iron chair. This torture device was used extensively during the Middle Ages. Victims would be placed onto the chair, which featured hundreds of sharp spikes, followed by the progressive tightening of iron restraints, forcing the spikes deep into the flesh. This could go on for hours, sometimes days. The spikes did not penetrate vital organs, and blood loss was minimized, at least until the person was released from the chair. Death often followed. The iron chair was often used as a psychological instrument of torture. Victims would often confess after being forced to watch other prisoners being tortured by the device. Number 2. Pair of anguish. This heinous contraption was used during the Middle Ages as a way to torture women who were accused of facilitating a miscarriage. It was also used to punish liars, blasphemers, and homosexuals. The device was inserted into one of the prisoner's orifices: the vagina for women, the anus for homosexuals, and the mouth for liars and blasphemers, which is why it's also known as the choke pair. The device features 4 metal leaves that slowly separate from each other as the torturer turned the screw at the top. The torturer could use it to tear the skin or expand it to its maximum size to mutilate the victim. It rarely caused death, but was often followed by other torture methods. Number 1. The Judas Cradle. Also called the Judas Chair, this Italian invention was particularly cruel. Using ropes, a prisoner would be lowered above the pyramid-shaped seat, with the point inserted into the anus or vagina. Victims would be tortured by the intense pressure and stretching of the orifice, resulting in permanent damage. In many cases, the victim would succumb to rips in the muscle tissue that would later become infected. Weights would be added to facilitate the effect, often resulting in death by impalement. A similar device called the Spanish donkey, or wooden horse, achieved a similar effect. Victims straddled the triangular horse and were forced to place their full body weight on their crotch, which rested on the point of the angle. That brings us to the end of this episode, all about the top 10 medieval torture methods. Which of the entries on today's list did you find the most gruesome? After watching this, I'm kind of glad that I wasn't around in the Middle Ages. Let us know your thoughts in the comments section down below. If you enjoyed this video, remember to drop a like and subscribe to the channel so that you never miss out on any of the latest and greatest content that Thump has to offer. As always, thanks for watching. See you again soon in the next episode.